January 22nd, 2025. Attendance has been taken, noting that Councillor Garneau and Councillor Pierce are online. Councillor Chambers isn't with us yet tonight, but he has a tendency of coming in late, so he might still be with us. With that being said, it takes us to number 2 on the agenda, which is the approval of the agenda. Does anyone have anything to add to the agenda? Seeing none, I'd like a motion to approve the agenda. Councillor Kyle, seeking seconder. Councillor Bell, thank you. All those in favor of the agenda the way it stands? Thank you. Declaration of pecuniary interests. I don't see any. I'd like to get a motion to convene as a committee in the whole. Councillor Coleman and Councillor Miller, thank you. All those in favor? Opposed and carried, thank you. Takes us to number 5 on the agenda, which is the external agencies presentations. And the first one on the agenda is the Grand River Conservation Authority, and you're here to present. If you'd like to just, when you get to the podium, give us your name and who you represent for the clerk, you can just go to town.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. My name is Samantha Lawson. I'm the CAO of the Grand River Conservation Authority, and I have my colleague here, Karen Armstrong, who is the Deputy CAO, who will also be sharing the task of presenting the draft budget to you today.
Thank you.
So we were very cognizant this time of timing, so we hope that we meet the time limits.
Actually, now that you said that, maybe I can get a motion to go over time if we need to. Councillor Howes and Councillor Oakley, all those in favor, just let them have more time if needed. Opposed, carried. There you go.
Okay, thank you very much. Oops. Oh, just really. Okay. So the Grand River Conservation Authority operates a range of programs in engineering, planning, land management, recreation, and education. Our strategic mandate is to develop and implement watershed-based programs that protect people and property from flooding and erosion, improve the health of the watershed, connect people to the environment, and manage our land holdings sustainably. Our programs balance human, environmental, and economic needs so that we can deliver on our vision of a healthy watershed now and for future generations. Our first strategic priority is to protect life and minimize property damage from flooding and erosion. The GRCA board recently approved our water control structure asset management plan, as well as our ice management plan and reservoir operation policy. The GRCA owns and operates 28 dams. 8 of the dams are used to manage flows within the watershed and are classified as multi-purpose dams, which are actively operated year-round to manage river flows related to flood mitigation and water supply during periods of low flow. An asset management plan has been completed for the 8 flood control and flow augmentation dams, as well as the 6 dike and flood wall systems. The plan provides clear documentation and support for the decision-making process for prioritizing maintenance and managing the water control infrastructure assets. The reservoir operation policy has been developed based on recommendations of the Royal Commission inquiry into the 1974 flood, to ensure that competing objectives of flood management and flow augmentation are met with high reliability throughout the year. The ice management plan is a compilation of the GRCA's knowledge, experience, and the high-level approaches that are used to monitor ice conditions, anticipate potential for ice jams, mitigate ice jam potential where possible, and monitor ice conditions during breakup processes. Another aspect of mitigating flood damages is our role in planning and development. GRCA staff undertake reviews and comment on Planning Act applications and planning documents from a natural hazard perspective, which includes flooding and erosion hazards, wetlands, and storm quantity control. The beginning of April in 2024, the province released a new regulation, Ontario Regulation 41-24, that prohibited activities, exemptions, and permits. And this regulation is to replace the past regulation 15006, or permitting regulation. However, much of the GRCA's regulatory process is still the same. The primary objective of Source Water Protection Program is protecting drinking water sources from contamination and depletion. The program supports the updating and implementation of policies to protect the county's drinking water sources in a wide geographic area that extends beyond the county's limits, known as a wellhead protection area. Source protection staff have been working with the County of Brant to incorporate Bethel drinking water system updates into a Grand River Source Protection Plan amendment that underwent consultation with municipalities and the ministry in the fall of 2024. Public consultation on that amendment will begin in February 2025. This amendment includes technical work and policy revisions for a new sodium and chloride issue contributing area at the Bethel drinking water system and a conformity exercise to bring the plan under the 2021 technical rules. The GRCA is committed to improving health of the Grand River watershed, often serving as a facilitator of discussions of watershed-wide issues among various levels of governments and other agencies. The GRCA Wastewater Optimization Program promotes a data-based decision-making and operational practices to achieve performance targets that go beyond compliance. This allows the county and other watershed municipalities to better understand the capability and the capacity of their wastewater treatment facilities and get the most out of these important assets. The GRCA also delivers a voluntary rural water quality program to help farmers implement best practices to improve and protect surface and groundwater quality. Since 2002, over 1,000 rural water quality projects have been completed in the County of Brant. As part of our water quality monitoring program, the GRCA has also installed a new monitoring sensor at the Brant Water Quality Station to improve characterization of urban and rural sources of excess nutrients in the Grand River. At the GRCA, we connect people with the natural environment by providing environmental education programs and access to outdoor spaces. A vital part of the watershed's recreational infrastructure, our conservation areas host over 2 million visitors a year and are an important part of the local economy, for paying property taxes, hiring local staff, and supporting the vibrant tourism industry in our communities. I think I went too fast there, but anyway, the GRCA owns approximately 48,000 acres of conservation land, including 11 active fee-for-use conservation areas, the Luther Marsh Wildlife Management Area, 5 nature centers, cottage lots, agricultural leases, passive recreation, and rail trails. The GRCA board recently approved a conservation area strategy, as well as a land inventory as required to revisions under the Conservation Authorities Act. The strategy provides an integrated high-level framework that will help guide and inform GRCA's decision-making related to the land that it owns and controls. The land inventory provides information on the GRCA properties and will support implementation of the strategy and management of GRCA's lands. Other strategic priorities include compliance and implementation of the amendments to the Conservation Authorities Act and enhancing Indigenous awareness, understanding, and relationships. All the new requirements that were required under the updates through the Conservation Authorities Act have been completed and approved by the board, and the GRCA continues to work with our First Nation partners to facilitate mutual learning, sharing of information, and to establish a stronger working relationship. Also to note is the GRCA is in the process of working through the development of a new strategic plan for 2025. So I'm just going to pass the rest over to my colleague, Karen.
Sorry about that. So moving right into the discussion about the budget for 2025, the information that has been provided to you is based on our first draft of our budget. Our second draft is actually going to our board this Friday. No changes from a municipal apportionment perspective, but certainly from a special projects and things like that. So some of the numbers that we're presenting tonight is based on the first draft and is not reflective of the second draft changes. We have budget challenges. I'm sure many of these will be common in municipalities. Inflation, supply chain issues, labor force shortages, Certainly projecting conservation area operating revenue is challenging for us because it is based on consumer demand and ultimately weather conditions. Our environmental education program, known as our Nature Center program, is in transition, so the pace of that change is difficult to predict at this point. We have aging infrastructure all throughout the watershed in our conservation areas and nature center facilities. We have increased demands on managing our passive lands, and we are working to keep pace with digital innovation and technological advancements from a customer service perspective especially. So this is just an overall summary of the changes from 2024 to 2025. Again, though, this is based on our first draft of our budget. So it's approximately $1 million more. This is a breakdown of the operating budget. So category 1, so this is category 1 in general operating are what combine to make municipal apportionment. So category 1, $11 million, general operating 3.9, category 2, 1.1, category 3, 14.9, and there's just the kind of the summary of what those programs and services are in the various categories. In terms of our capital budget, category 1 capital, $3.3 million. So this is the water management capital, dikes, dams, gauges and hardware, and general operating expenses of $750,000. And then our category 3, we have a budget, we have $2 million in the budget for conservation areas. Our special projects, again, this was based on the first draft, category 2 of $870,000. So those are the rural water quality grants and species at risk project. And for category 3, we have Mill Creek Rangers who work within a specific area of the watershed to do stewardship work, and the Brantford Water Festival. So there are some additional special projects that will be included, certainly in the final draft of the budget related to wastewater optimization, floodplain mapping projects, ecological restoration, and a sub-watershed study in the city of Kitchener. So overall revenue by category, just a breakdown, we are almost 50% self-generated, and 3 of the categories there, you know, certainly about a third of our revenue is from municipal apportionment. So that would be category 1, municipal apportionment, general operating expenses, municipal apportionment, and then the category 2, municipal apportionment, which is that is based on our signed memorandum of understanding. So overall, the increase is 3.5%. We've provided the increase for the past 2 years' budgetary increases. So this does represent a 5.4% increase for the County of Brant because of the way the apportionment formula is applied. So the 2025 amount is $417,037. And with that, we would be happy to take any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. After spending the last 4 days in downtown Toronto, I have great respect for what you do, and I see the value in what you do, so thank you. Is there any questions to the presenter? Councillor Bell, you're first.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to our delegation. You said that projecting operating revenues is challenging, so how do you do it?
Yes, through you, Mayor Bailey. So projecting revenue for conservation areas is challenging. So we look at the prior year's budget, prior year's actuals, and then we just generally had a percentage to that, what we think is reasonable based on anticipated activities that we're operating. You know, generally our usage is fairly consistent, so we make projections based on a slight increase over the prior year, and then we would do any forecast adjustments throughout the year if we were significantly off by that, for some reason.
What are the trends like? Is it continuing over the last 10 years? Could you say you've seen a growth of 5% per year? Just help me out on that.
I'm sorry, I don't have the percentage of what that growth would be. I could certainly get back to you on that. We have seen an increase in the people coming out to experience our conservation areas. You know, certainly through COVID, our usage was high, and it has continued to be high. And so we don't have any reason to believe that that would decline in 2025, but sorry, I don't have the specific percentage. I could get back to you.
Thank you.
Well, any other questions? Councillor Miller, you're next.
Thank you. A few questions, Mr. Mayor, through to Karen or Samantha. Rural Water Quality Program. Do you know what our contribution is for this year? I don't remember seeing it in our budget binder.
I would have to confirm with staff here, perhaps they know, I think it's 50,000 is given in grants.
Some
Does
years
that
it's
sound
nothing,
correct?
some years it's 50.
I believe it's 50,000.
So
given in
50,000, how does that compare to other municipalities?
grants. I don't have the breakdown. I apologize, but I could get back to you.
Because my understanding is that some of other municipalities to the north of us, they've embraced it maybe a little more than we have. So I'd be interested if you could.
Certainly, we could give the breakdown of that information. The Region of Waterloo has been a significant partner for that program, certainly historically and currently. So
Because the city of Brantford got out of it. I've been working on them every year to get back in it. They haven't, even though they've become more rural. So, okay, if you could find those numbers, that'd be great. 2024 surplus, what are you projecting it to come in at?
Sorry, I did bring our budget document, and I'm anticipating that it says it in there. I don't know that I have that number in here, though, off the top of my head. Certainly. Sorry, I would just be spending my time flipping through a document. I'll get back to you about that. Sorry.
Okay, you're making a list. Flood study. We did a flood study for Paris. I'm not sure what the status of that is, and I just wondered because I know the GRCA helps other municipalities with their flood studies and flood mapping and all that. Was the GRCA involved with Paris's flood study?
Through you, Mayor, Paris's flood study, the SPA, are you talking about? I do know that there was reach-based mapping that was done and that the GRCA was working with county staff in terms of updating the floodplain mapping, and I think the implementation of that project will happen in 2025, but I'm not sure if that's the Paris floodplain study that you're referring to.
Yeah, and I'm not sure either. Okay. What I'd like to know is, like I say, does the GRCA, are they consistent in helping out the municipalities along the Grand with any flood work that they're doing? And I don't know if that's.
So we are the lead in floodplain mapping.
Yeah, that I know. Yeah.
Yep. So we help it. It's really, to be honest, it's driven by development. So if there is a trigger through a development process, secondary plan to update the modeling or even updating it or creating a modeling, then the GRC would participate in that.
Yeah, the flood study wasn't part of a planning application or anything. It was just, we need to do this and we got to spend some serious money. It's in the tens of millions of dollars. Okay, I'll leave that at that. Last question, and Karen, you touched on it in your presentation, the outdoor nature centers. It's kind of tough to predict. When I look at the our levy for the county for 2025, you're $417,000. That does not include any money for nature reserves. Is that correct?
For the nature centers?
The nature center, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes as in no.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, 470. So you but they're still operating for 2025. That's being funded from a reserve that you guys quite smartly put aside money for. Do you foresee a conclusion to that in 2025? I do, but I just want to know if you do.
Through you, Mary, yes, we're hoping that there's a conclusion to that.
Okay, I don't like the word hope coming from us, from you guys. Yeah, you will see that. Okay, fair enough. Okay, thank you. And yeah, you made a list of what we need to know.
You have your list for Councillor Miller?
We do.
I wouldn't come back without it if I were you. Are there any other questions for the delegation? Councillor Bell?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for a second go round. I won't ask for a third one tonight. I watched the Brantford City Council Committee of the Whole last night, and their agenda was really focused on one issue, and that was nitrates. Could you just share with us what the GRCA's role is in managing the nitrate content of the water that's in the river?
So through you, Mayor, our role is actually quite limited. The revisions that were done to the Conservation Authority Act and the subsequent regulations really focuses the conservation authorities on flooding and flood management, so the natural hazard side of it. Through the Category 2 agreements that all of the participating municipalities sign, there's an element of water quality management per se. The province has a provincial water quality system that GRCA administers throughout the watershed, but the provincial system is at a much higher level than what is actually useful for a local municipality. So we do have 2 sensors at Bridgeport, and I'm trying to think, the second one is in the Brantford area. And those monitor the nitrate levels, and they're really more just to be used as a flag. It was identified in the water management plan 10, 15 years ago that nitrates were becoming an issue. I think recognizing, the watershed itself, that's part of the premise of the rural water quality program, is to keep all of the nutrients on the landscape and not have it run in. We also have the wastewater optimization program. So when they were referring to the action group that the GRCA was leading, we are bringing municipalities to the table that want to sit and who are having similar problems as well, or challenges with managing nitrate, to get a kind of collective group going. There are academics and First Nation communities as well that have been invited. So I would say our role is more as a facilitator, to help the conversation and to get things going amongst municipalities within the watershed. And then we do provide some monitoring information to the municipalities as well. But and I guess there's source water protection too, but we don't really play a very active role in that.
So there's no budgetary element for increasing the control on nitrates.
Right. I mean, we highly encourage the municipalities to participate in the rural water quality program. There's not a simple solution for it, and it's one of those problems where it takes a long time to see sort of the value of your work. But certainly, the rural water quality program is a gem that is recognized throughout the province. It's doing some pretty incredible things. So it would be something to encourage other municipalities as well to join that haven't.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Councillor Miller?
Just a comment on the nitrates, and what Sam said about the GRCA, their role is not to control it, because they can't control it, but they have been playing, I thought, a pretty good lead role in helping to identify sources and to encourage. And it's the municipality, at the end of the day, it's the municipality's responsibility to control what's going in there. And that's why I asked about the rural water quality program, because I know big job is preventing agricultural runoff. And if I recall, I think the majority of the nitrates does come from agricultural runoff. I thought the majority come from the wastewater, but I don't believe so. I think it's around a third, depending on the time of year and all that. So, and so they have the rural water quality program for the agricultural sector, but they also do awards to recognize the wastewater treatment plants and whoever makes big progress there. So I think they've done good work as far as helping municipalities get there, but at the end of the day, it is on municipalities to try and control that nitrate, because nitrates is anybody that has an aquarium knows how hard it is to get rid of it.
You should be part of the delegation, Councillor Miller. You know a lot. Are there any other questions to the delegation? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Which takes us to 5.2, which is Long Point, and that's Judy Maxwell.
See if I can run this.
And again, just your name and who you represent for the clerk.
Thank you, Judy Maxwell with Long Point Region Conservation Authority. I'm the general manager there.
Thank you.
So good evening, Mayor Bailey and councillors. See if I can get these advanced. So on the screen, there's just some quick facts about LPRCA and the watershed. So we're located on the north shore of Lake Erie water basin. We have 6 sub-watersheds areas that drain into Lake Erie. We own just over 11,000 acres, And some key items in the land holdings are 9 dams and 4 water control structures. We operate 5 campgrounds and have 7,500 acres of actively managed forest tracts. The authority also has designated 1,145 acres of forest as natural heritage woodland. And we have also 800 acres of uplands and marsh east of Port Rowan. And the authority employs 20 full-time employees and 43 seasonal employees. So on the next slide, it's just some of the accomplishments for 2024. In the watershed, supported by external funding, there were 44,727 trees planted, 2 erosion control projects completed on private land. There is also 1,504 acres of cover crops supported. And at the end of the year, we had the deadline to complete the 6 required plans and strategies that are outlined in the Conservation Authorities Act. You heard from Sam on some of them, and they're listed there on the slide under the corporate area. And they were part of the requirements of the new Conservation Authorities Act. So the board has approved those. We've also completed a refresh for the strategic plan that takes us to 2027. The 2024 accomplishments continued. So in the forestry area, we did complete the 5-year operational plan for the forest management. We continue with ecological surveys on 6 forest tracts. Funding was secured to continue with invasive species control, and we controlled species on 1,147 acres, or 15 of our properties. There was 198 permits were issued for various development in the watershed, and also in 2024 there was 10 flood statements issued, and the Victoria Dam class environmental assessment was completed. We have 2 school boards that we have contracts with that sent students to the Bacchus Heritage Conservation Area for outdoor and heritage programs, and there were 3,555 students that participated in the heritage and outdoor education programming. On the 5 campgrounds, we had 455 seasonal campers, which was up slightly over 2023, and we also had 8,465 overnight stays, which was up about 14% over 23. So in 2025, the priorities for the authority, we're going to continue with the invasive species control on LPRCA forest tracts. We're going to continue to deliver the flood forecast awarding programs for the watershed, and we have 2 federal funded projects for a hydrology study update for the watershed and flood hazard mapping for Nanticoke Creek. We're going to continue to offer the tree planting, cover crop initiatives, and erosion control funding to private landowners. And we did submit an application for the whole watershed in 2024, but we were only successful in securing federal funding of $512,000 over 3 years for phosphorus reduction in the Big Otter Creek sub-watershed. There is a portion of the Otter Creek, the East Branch, which is in Brant County, and farmers would be eligible for funding for cover crops, erosion control structures, and other best management practices. It has just started to be advertised on our website, and Paul Gagnon is a contact in our office. And we'll be doing some direct mailing to the residents in the area. So 2025 budget drivers, there was a cost of living adjustment was approved for 3% for the wage scale adjustment. There was other increases for the statutory deductions that are required and employee benefit increases. So our overall compensation costs increased 2.5% or $95,000, and that is our largest expense. And the total compensation is $3.9 million, which is just over 64% of our total operation expenditures. The Minister of Natural Resources sent a directive. It was renewed for the third year to not change the planning and permit fees, which continue to remain at the 2022 rates. Also, there's been no increase in funding from the province for the mandated programs and services, and it's static at the 2019 level, which actually was a 50% reduction that year. So we have to get creative on other revenue sources. So this is a snapshot of the 2025 consolidated budget. The overall budget is $6.89 million, and the municipal levy increase for operating and capital is $60,278, or 2.58% increase, which takes it to $2.39 million. The levy support for the budget is at 35%, and that leaves 65% that is funded from other sources. So this is for Brant County. The apportionment for 2025 operating budget piece is $162,960, which represents 7.28% of our operating budget. The 2025 capital budget, Brant County's apportionment for that is $11,470, which represents 7.28% for the capital budget, same percentages. So the 2025 capital projects, some of the category 1 projects that are supported with levy is that we have Teeterville Dam Class Environmental Assessment. Phase 1 started in 2024, and the second phase is starting in 2025. It's a 2-year project. We also have a dam safety review on Deer Creek Dam to be completed this year, and also we'll be starting one for the Lehman Dam. And those projects, we receive funding from the provincial government through the WECI fund, as they call it. Other project is just computer upgrades, some forest tracks, gates to secure property, or parking lot upgrades, and signage for risk management on 24 prioritized properties. And we're going to continue to do signage over the next 5 years on various properties to help mitigate risk. And those are the other capital projects for this year. So this is just a summary of the consolidated municipal levy with the other municipalities in our watershed. And it just shows that the Brant total portion there is $174,430, or 7.28% for the operations and capital projects. So relating to the budget for Brant County, some programs and services that tie to Brant County is the planning and permit services are provided to the residents of Brant County. There are 2 groundwater wells located in Brant County, which are monitored as part of the provincial groundwater monitor network. We have installed a water temperature gauge, and it's monitoring water temperature in Upper Big Creek, and the Ontario Low Water Response monitoring of conditions in the watershed. Brant County would be included if that happens in the spring and summer. Continuing with the other items from the 2025 budget, flood forecast and warning services for the watershed. We're going to continue to offer the tree planting program. Also, we own 1,500 acres in Brant County, and there's active forest management on the tracks. Brant County residents in the subwatershed of the Big Otter Creek will be eligible for funding to help reduce the phosphorus loading. And also, this project, we applied for funding, and it was secured for Upper Big Creek flood and erosion hazard mapping, and that project will start in 2026. Because you could apply over 3 years. So that project will be started, and I know that's something that Brant County staff have been, will be happy to know that we're actually going to be having that project completed. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any questions from council? Councillor Pierce, Councillor Garneau, I hope I haven't missed your hand. No, you're okay. Anyone, Councillor Miller?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to CAO Maxwell. Judy, are you expecting a 2024 year-end surplus?
The 2024, we're just getting ready for the audit. The auditors will be coming next week. And yeah, we are expecting to be a surplus, but I'm not sure the exact results. Our AGM's on March 7th.
What does the Long Point Conservation Authority usually do with the year-end surplus?
So depending how the funds are generated, we have some reserves that are set up. So either be general reserves or specific funds.
Okay. Outdoor education, category 1, 2, or 3?
Outdoor education is category 3. And we have an endowment fund that helps support that program, but
Okay.
we have increased the fees, and we're very close to having the wages covered for delivering the programs. The cost for the building and things like that, utilities are covered by the revenue out of from the interest of the endowment fund.
Okay. It's a little different than the GRC. Odd question here, but tree plantings. Do you
Yep.
call before you dig? Do you do locates?
For tree planting?
Yeah.
Not that I know. No,
Councillor Kyle and I both learned that you're supposed to.
call before you dig. Well, I
Yes.
guess if you're maybe within the road allowance, I'm not
No,
sure.
no, that's what we went to Aroma conference here, and that was one of the sessions. So if you break ground, you would need to do a locate. So, and I said, I don't think anyone does that for tree planting. So, you have 13, the LP Long Point Conservation owns 13 water control structures. You have no hydroelectric though, is that correct?
No
Have you
hydroelectric.
done feasibility on any of the dams to see if that's a possibility?
No, we haven't, but I'm not sure if there would be any opportunity with the size and the water flow. So I would say no, we haven't, and I don't know that there would be any opportunity for that.
Even the dam you showed in the
Size.
photograph
Where-
would have,
Sorry.
the one you had in the photograph would have been, I think, a possibility. I just know that in the province of Ontario, we're going to consume more electricity than we produce by 2030. The IESO is always looking. I guess they're going to be issuing RFPs every year now rather than every so often. And hydro's obviously a favorable source of power, given that it's good for base loads. It's cleaner than pretty much any other renewable out there. So I think it's something that should be looked at. I know, and you probably know this too, the GRCA has 3, I think, going, and generates a nice little bit of money for their revenue. So
Yeah,
maybe,
that's,
like I say, a feasibility study doesn't cost too much, and if it one is or 2 or 3 or 4 is good, I would be looking at that. So, but
okay. Thank
okay.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Judy.
Are there any other questions to the delegation? Seeing none, your takeaway is to call before you dig,
Call before you dig.
and I'll call Chuck Beach and let him know that he's to call before he digs.
And we survived a year with Robert Chambers chair.
There you go. I'll call
Sorry,
Robert,
dear.
and yeah, Robert will call before he digs too. So thank you very much. Which takes us to 5.3, which is the John Noble Home. Anna? These two ladies have only been in their present positions for a very short time, so be kind and be patient with these two ladies.
Good evening. Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm Anna Gora. I am acting administrator for John Noble Home, and this is Raquel, and she is our director of finance. So today, Raquel will present on John Noble Home budget. Go ahead.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and councilors. So the 2025 operational and capital budget have been developed in accordance with the guidelines set by the Plan County. It includes all salaries, wages and benefits, costs, as well as contingencies for unsold contracts, annual capital projects scheduled for completion. The budget reflects inflationary pressures between the industry, which are not fully offset by provincial funding, leading to the expectation that municipality will be covered the shortfall. The 2025 budget shows an increase of 34,204 or 1.15% compared to the 2024 budget. Additionally, the county share has risen by 1.52% in comparison to the 2024 budget. Revenue projection for 2025 and based on estimated in-case mix index of 1.0025 increases for 2024. This increase will generate more revenues for the home, and but therefore we're gonna need some help and support from the municipalities. The next slide will be basically our 2025 operational budget review. The net combined, the gross revenues that we are expecting for 2025 will be 20,079,320. The gross expenditure that we're projecting is 23,078,140. Total combined that we're going to be required for between municipalities is 2,964,708. The county share for the year 2025 is 833,672. In comparison of 2024 budget that it was 821,199. So the increase will be 12,473 for the total for the county share. That percentage will be 1.52%. The next slide is basically our capital projects projection. We have placed the total amount of 663,309. The total amount with the county share will be 184,399,000 for the year. The project that we're going to be working on are listed in our. There we have total of 6 projects that we're planning to work on 2025. So for us, that's it. If you have any questions, I'll get that back to you.
Are there any questions for the delegation? Councillor Bell, you're first.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Anna and Raquel. You said we're estimating a CMI of 1.0025. What is it today?
Through you, Mr. Councillor, right now we have 0.096.
And if it stayed at 0.0996, what would be the shortfall in terms of revenues?
If we go the same amount next year that you were saying, sorry.
In dollar amount.
In dollar amount, yeah. So the shortfall will be around $200,000.
Okay. And what are we doing to make sure that CMI, which is our estimated
So right
Yeah.
now, yes, through you, Mr. Counselor. So right now we have a place, we we hire a RIDE coordinator as a full-time RIDE coordinator, and she's working with all the nurses as well. The majority of the different RNs and other RPMs as well, so they can help to record more data, so we can increase the amount. I'm gonna pass that to
Maybe I can answer
yeah,
that better.
Anna, because she will know better that section. Thanks.
So thank you very much through you, Mayor, Mr. Mayor, Councillor. So this is CMI is quite complex. How we generate the CMI. So really, it ties up a lot with the administrative costs, like which we're talking about RAI. So RAI was basically brought up from 3 days a week to now 5 days a week. So the coding is now by the RAI coordinator from Monday to Friday. And also the idea was to generate more coders. So our RNs and RPNs, they all coding. So so why are we doing this? Because even if we have one coder who goes around the home area and codes, that coding is actually not reflecting the complexity of the residents, because that coder does not interact with the residents day to day. And the second thing is, once we lose that coder for whatever reason, then the operation is still not to the, it's not carried to the fullest. So the idea is to have a lot of coders who actually coding the actual complexity of the residents at the time. So we accomplishing that. Like, I know it's a long process and it doesn't reflect yet in CMI, but the idea is, I think, gonna work. We just need a little bit time to execute it to the fullest. That's number one. All my registered staff will be effectively coding, and that is the goal. So that's, and the second thing is staffing issues. So John Noble Home is experiencing a lot of staffing issues right now, and I think other homes too. So that also affects the coding per se, how much we can code per day, capturing that complexity. The third aspect is we receiving a lot of residents who are very complex. So hence, so I deploy all my staff to really cater to the resident needs. So that is less time allocated for coding, I would say, right? So resident is always number one. And then once we coding, that timing is maybe less than 45 minutes per day per nurse. So, so that time fluctuates. So the more complex residents are, the less time they actually spending coding. So sometimes we're not capturing to the fullest the complexity of the residents. I don't know, I kind of map out other organizations, how they do it. So let's say hospitals, they have separate coders and they have separate budgets for the coders. Long-term care facilities, they don't have the separate budget for coders. They just have the RAI coordinator budget, and they don't have additional funds for the coders to come and code independently. And I also don't think it's the best practice to capture the complexity. It's time saving, but I don't think it really reflects the complexity of the residents. And in 2025, we're projecting CMI being estimated on brand new coding program. So the government now is asking us to switch from previous coding program to the new one. So I think this is going to be quite interesting, and I believe it's going to be reflecting better what's happening in LTC. So.
Thank you. That was complex.
you.
I'm not sure I understood everything of it. One final question. The 40-bed project that we're in the middle of has a potential to overrun in cost by 2-point-something million. Where do we reflect that in this budget submission?
So through you, Councillor, it is reflected in, I just had to, give me a second. Just gonna bring the numbers. So the incremental cost that was reflected in this budget is based in 2 months. So it will be November and December. But the time that we were building up the budget, we had information through the contractors that the 40 beds will be opening by November 1st. So now I hope I'm following. That cost, the incremental cost and revenues that we were expecting to receive from the ministry for those 2 couple months were estimated of 800,000 or 4,000 revenue. And then we were expecting to spend 847,000 to that revenue, giving the municipalities. So we're gonna need it. We were planning to need from the municipality 42,884 for those 2 couple months. Thousand, sorry.
Sorry.
So
Val,
basically,
you may be going down an operating budget. I was more interested in capital overrun and how we reflect that.
oh, and yeah,
Sorry, I didn't want to stop you, but
yeah, sorry.
that was more my question.
Yeah, yes.
Yep.
We've just came to an agreement with VDA on the final costs, and so we wanted to come in and have a separate meeting about that, the cost overruns, rather than talking about it now, because it's come down drastically from what we were talking there, but we're still in that $2 million mark. But we have to look at the process and everything, bringing it forward properly. So if you can just give us about a week or two, but we want to bring that to council and have the final approvals from both councils by the end of February is kind of the plan at this point. So I don't think you're in a position to really answer that question at this point.
Yeah, to you, Mr. Councilor, no, we are not right now ready. We know from the past, you probably have the information is over 2 million, right? But we don't have exactly numbers right now.
If we can just note that the reason we've allowed this from the delegation, Councilor McAlpine is the chair of the John Noble Home, and we are under huge changeovers right now. So maybe some of the questions that you would ask the ladies here just isn't quite fair yet because we haven't come to any real. But we will get back to you with another list. This will be a John Bell list, and we'll make sure that you get it. So thank you, Councilor McAlpine, for helping the ladies out because everything is kind of up in the air right now.
That's correct.
Thank you so much.
Councilor Pierce.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you. Just a quick question. So on the capital project budget, it states there that the county share is 27.8% of the overall. Fine and dandy. If we figure out the operating budget, it's not much higher, but the operating budget is almost 28.2%, or sorry, is 28.2%. I'm just wondering why the share for the county of the operating budget is more of a percentage than the share of the capital budget. Again, it's not much, but I would assume that they would be the same percentage, and they're not. Again, it's only like about a 0.5% or so more, but it just struck me as odd that we're paying different percentage of the capital budget as we are the operating budget. I thought it was a set percentage that we paid, but they seem different.
To you, Mr. Councilor, they are the same. They are the same share, so 27.8%, both of them.
Okay.
Probably, I don't understand the question. Sorry.
Okay, so if we look at the operating budget, okay, the whole combined is 2,964,708. Okay, the county share is 833,672. As a percentage, that's about 28.1%. With the capital budget, our share is 184,399.90, of the total 663,309. That's 27.8%. Again, it's not a big difference, but I just found it odd that the percentage that we're paying of the capital is different than the percentage we're paying of the operating. That's all. Again, it doesn't make a big difference, but it just struck me as odd that we're not paying the same percentage for both of them. That's all. Do we understand why or no?
I had to get back to you.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. As I say, it's not. It's just I just happened to do the math, and it's just different numbers, and it just struck me as odd. That's all. So I would just like to understand. Is our share supposed to be 28.1%, or is our share supposed to be 27.8%? Again, it's not much of a difference. It just struck me as odd that we're paying a different percentage on each of them. That's all.
Sorry, you want to help? It is 28.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. It should be 27.8%. There is a little anomaly. I know there was a revenue on the Bell Lane housing that kind of plays with the number a little bit, but I'll work with John Noble Home and we'll get an explanation for that.
Okay, like I said, it's not a big deal. It just struck me as odd. That's all.
It's just a calculation.
Thanks, Heather.
So yes, so it's basically the portion for both the long-term care, because we run as well the long-term care, Bell Lane apartments in Dainstate. And in this case, we don't have anything for Dainstate, but we do have some for Bell Lane, and that is causing a little differences in there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through to the delegation. Do you guys plant tree? No, forget that's another. I wanted to ask about the transfer to reserves, $271,680. What's that reserve for?
Which one? Sorry. The reserve?
Transfer to reserves, $271,680, and I wonder what that reserve is for. That's for staff?
Yes, that's questions for us.
Okay.
Through you, Mr. Mayor. That's our transfer to reserve for the John and Hope. Like, we go way back. That used to go to St.
Joe's for capital?
Yeah, and then we just moved it over, so it goes now to the capital reserve to fund John and Home capital projects.
Okay, so transfer to capital reserves. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and then when we time the need, when we need it, then we can just tell them, and they will release the funds.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for the delegation? Knowing that the John Noble Home is in a little bit of flux right now, so there will be a list of the answers to the questions coming forward. Seeing no other questions, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. I invite Councillor Chambers to the table. It would make me feel more complete. Okay, it takes us to number 6.1 on the agenda, which is the long-term financial plan. There you are. And again, if you'd like to just give us your name and who you represent for the clerk.
Good evening, members of the committee, staff, and members of the public. My name is Byron Tan, and I represent Watson & Associates. I'm here tonight to provide you a presentation, really an update to the long-term financial plan. This process has started actually dating back to the end of 2023 when we started undertaking a review of your operating capital budgets, really a holistic look at all of your services. However, because we had a little thing called the development charge background study, the focus was ensuring that that bylaw continued on before its expiry date. So we're now here again, really to present the draft findings and really supporting the proposed information that you would have seen last week with respect to the budget that staff would have presented. So really tonight, my purpose here is really to provide you a little bit of a reminder or a recap of the scope of the assignment, some of the assumptions we've utilized as part of the long-term financial plan, go through a brief overview of the framework. I won't spend too much time on it. It's really more of a refresher to kind of let you know what type of inputs we utilize, what type of items and data points we used in order to inform a 10-year forecast for the county. And really from there, we'll talk about the growth forecast assumptions, which is really stemming from the work that was undertaken through the development charge background study. And then we'll go through some of the other inputs to the model, such as operating budgets, how the revenues and expenditures are forecasted over the next 10 years. We'll then break it down into the capital that is anticipated to occur within the county over the next 10 years. And keep in mind that the presentation here is focused on the tax-supported services. It's our understanding that you, as a county, will be undertaking a water and wastewater rate study this year. So the findings of that and how the rate study will be funding the capital and operating program of the rate-supported works. Once that study is finalized, then we can combine the two, and then you can see a holistic view of not only the tax, but also the rate-supported information as well. So as I mentioned, once we go through the operating and capital, I'll provide you with an overview of and a summary of the tax rate impacts over the next 10 years. As well, we've also ran an option, and you may have recalled seeing this when I last presented with my colleague. We do have an option to look at, putting away additional monies into a reserve fund for your hospital. Again, this is something where there's a lot of unknowns still that are occurring as part of that project. So what we're trying to do is really run an impact analysis as to how much could we generate by adding, let's say, a 1% an increase in addition to the forecasted percentages over that 10-year period, and see what would that look like from a reserve fund contribution over that time horizon. Subsequent to that, really I'll just come with a bit of observations from what we've seen to date, and as well as some strategies for council as well. What you will see tonight is the tax rates that we're presenting is an unsmooth or basically a raw set of data that, based on the expenditures and revenues in a particular year, this is potentially how much the tax rate should go up or down. Obviously, for municipal planning, you'd want to ensure to mitigate those types of ebbs and flows. So there are some strategies that we can discuss in order to, hopefully keep that at a steady pace. Maybe an average of, 5%, 6%, whatever the number may be. But instead of it going up, 1 year, coming down because you'll need that much in that particular year, etc. And then happy to answer any questions throughout the presentation. However, I do find sometimes, as I mentioned, it's probably every time I'm here, a question is typically a good segue into a following slide. So, feel free to ask questions where you see fit. However, I'm happy to take questions at the end as well. So, just a bit of a recap on the scope of the assignment. Again, we've worked with the county staff, over the past year, really, to develop this long-term financial plan as well as all the inputs within it. It's been a great process being able to go, really into the numbers of what the county is anticipating to undertake in terms of operating costs, expenditures, and potentially a forecast of non-tax revenues, which will help inform our potential tax levy. So it was a really holistic review of the tax-supported services, and this is something where I would say kudos to staff to being able to at least put up with me to be able to put this analysis together. I already mentioned that this draft analysis presented tonight is primarily focused on the tax-supported rates. So I already said, the water and wastewater will come at a later date when you complete the water and wastewater rate study. And really, again, just prefacing that this is a draft analysis, which could change depending on the outcome of your budget approvals in February. So what does the long-term financial plan try to address? We are looking at incorporating, again, a number of data points into the model. Particularly, we look and examine your capital infrastructure needs. And how we look at that is, looking at all of the different plans, that formulate your capital forecast, particularly with respect to its timing, based on either priority or just, when it's slated within the next 10 years, as well as the costs. Obviously, that's a big factor in order to determine the impacts to your tax rates is, how much do these items cost. As well, through working with county staff, we've tried to, identify what are the sources of funding for these capital works. So if you were to go into the, the minutia of every single data point, you'll see every line item has a different, funding source. Whether if it's growth related, maybe there's a DC component. It could be funded from a reserve fund. Maybe your tax levy, again, is a capital levy contribution. You may also have grants or other subsidies that you're anticipating. So that's also been recognized. And then, any donations or any other contributions from outside sources. And then, of course, lastly, we won't forget our partners, such as the province and the federal government. Should there be any grants or any other sources of funding that we can draw upon, we've also identified that for every single line item. In terms of the operating costs, we've also taken a look at the infrastructure and services to accommodate the new population and employment. So we do have a starting point right now, as of from the year end 2024, to take a look at, what type of expenditures, at least on a per capita and a per employee basis, the county is experiencing, especially with your current population and employment. However, you are growing. So, we are trying to then identify or estimate how much would every single new resident or employee that's going to come to the county, what would they generate in terms of expenditures? Likewise, they should have a revenue amount associated with them as well. So we try to forward forecast that based on your current per capita and per employee cost and revenues. Now, there are some adjustments. Typically there's some efficiencies, economies of scale. So, for example, if you have one new resident, it doesn't mean you have to, exactly add one additional dollar for whatever service. There is that, that efficiency that we do recognize. So we do look at this from a case by case and service by service basis. We also take a look at the potential impacts, obviously, on the taxpayers over the planning horizon. So that's really, your tax rates that we calculate. And I mentioned, we are looking at the contribution to that hospital reserve fund as a scenario. Now, keep in mind, when we're looking at your capital forecasts, there's also another source of financing or funding is debt. So as part of this analysis, we are working with the county to monitor, what are your debt levels, especially over this 10-year period. What we're trying to look at is recognizing, your annual repayment limit. Obviously, the legislated amount that you're allowed to go is 25%. Anything above and beyond that, you have to request the province. 25% of your own revenues, I should say. However, I do understand that the county does have a self-imposed 15% limit. So this is something where when we look at the analysis, there's certain capital items that may perhaps, again, tread that line where now we may go over a certain number and maybe start approaching the that Ontario limit, just based on the nature of the capital works that are identified and the amounts, obviously, and costs and price tag associated with them. And then lastly, I'm not going to say this again, but as I mentioned, the water and wastewater rates are, again, not part of this analysis. But the purpose of this is eventually to amalgamate, all of these sources together and really form the foundation for future long-term financial plan updates, that county staff can take this and then, make the updates where necessary to help inform what potential tax rates or rate increases would be in the future. So since the last meeting, I do recall that we were here presenting to council back on the end of December 2023. Since that time, there's been a number of updates to the model. Obviously, we've had a whole calendar year pass, so now we are able to now incorporate the findings of your asset management plan. So that's a large component that's been included as part of the capital works. We obviously have the development charge background study. So a lot of the priority projects contained within that background study are also identified within our 10-year forecast. And then as well, in addition to those two items, the county still has a number of projects that you'd like to undertake, which are part of your capital budget. So you'll see any priority projects or any projects that council has directed county staff to include, or approved as part of that 10-year horizon, or at least even the short term. Those have been included as well within the analysis. And again, I'm not going to mention the last part. I think I've said that on 3 or 4 occasions with the water and wastewater. So just a bit of an overview. I think I already touched upon this, but essentially when we're looking at the long-term financial plan, I won't go deep into the details of the minutia of the calculations, but at a high level, the first thing we look at is what is your growth forecast relative to where you are today? So we have to look at an assessment based on your current population, current employment, and how we assess that is looking at, well, what is their tax generating, identifier, and that is their assessed values of their homes or the businesses, and that's what's counts towards your weighted assessment, which then calculates towards a tax rate revenue. So when we're looking at this, we start taking a look at what's the baseline, where are we starting, and looking at a growth forecast, what are we assuming over the next 10 years as part of increasing that assessment base in order to help inform our tax rates. So with that being said, if you just follow kind of the flow chart here, we start with proposed developing land area. We look at the growth forecast. We look at the population and employment associated with it, and then as I mentioned, we then incorporate all of the new assessment based on population and employment. Once we identify that, then we start taking a look at your operating budgets. So we take a look at both your operating revenues and operating expenditures. Now, as part of your operating revenues, there's a number of different factors to look at, but when you're taking a look at the actual numbers, there's always a component that's what's considered a non-tax revenue. So it's still revenues that municipalities, that the county collects, but it's not from your tax rate. It's from other miscellaneous factors. It could be user fees. It could be, contributions from other sources that you're utilizing towards your operating budget. Essentially anything to help net down the expenditures on the operating. So we identify that first, and then we then take a look at your operating expenditures. And once we've determined that, then there's our baseline. And as I said, any new operating forecast is based on that new assessment that would be occurring over that 10-year period. If you look at near the bottom, you'll see that then we talk about the capital expenditures. So although capital and operating could be seen as two different entities, there is a capital component that is being funded through your operating budget. And that could be an operating transfer straight to the capital levy. It could be operating transfers to reserves, which at one point in time, it will then be utilized for capital, or any other sources such as maybe paying off debt, right? Because debt is already tied to a capital item, so you are utilizing, operating funds to pay for these debt payments, and that's what we include on the bottom part of this flow chart. Once we get all that information, we put it all in, and then essentially what we try to determine is what is that net financial impact on the residents. So once we look at all your operating forecasts on expenditures, less any non-tax revenues, here's the remainder. This is essentially how we calculate our tax rates. So what did we use for the long-term financial plan? So as part of the 10-year growth forecast, again, the basis is really the development charge background study. So through that study, a lot of work was involved in order to determine, how much growth will occur within the municipality. And actually, the development charge background study actually went even farther. I believe it went out to 2051. However, for our purposes, we're only looking at a 10-year long-term financial plan, because once you start forecasting anything beyond that, then it's really just not exactly as accurate as possible, because you're so far out at that point and initiatives change. So how we look at this right now is we take a look at, as I said, the current baseline that we would use, and the county's current population, again, estimated, is about 41,673, with about just over 12,000 employees. However, if you look at the table at the bottom, over a 10-year period, it is estimated that we will have the county, could have a potential 2,369 units. And those units, obviously there's individuals living in them, so we took the persons per unit assumptions, again, from the development charge background study, and forecast a population of just under 6,500 people over this 10-year period. Similarly, we looked at your gross floor area as well as for non-residential, and the assumptions on the number of employees per square foot, and that translates to just over 2,100 employees. So these are now the numbers that we will use for our forward forecast over the 10-year period. And this leads to about a 15.5% increase in your population, or a 17.6% increase on your non-residential employees. So how does that look graphically? So you can see here, when we took the information of those populations relative to the units that they will be residing in, we worked with the county, as well as looking at different metrics, whether it's through MPACT or through your realty team, to try to determine an assessment value for these homes. Because now we have to calculate what is the assessment that would be generated from this, from this growth. So over the next 10 years, it is assumed that this is increasing at roughly about 1.9% per year. Now, if you drill down into the actual dollar amounts, you'll notice that in for the start of 2025, especially throughout 2024, the county actually grew an assessment of about $313 million. So that was a fairly large increase going from 2024 to the start of 2025. Now, having said that, with our growth forecast over the next 10 years, again, using the background study and using really a simplified, straight line or constant approach, we're assuming that from 2026 to 2034, we could add an additional $145 million per year. So we're not quite saying 300 million every single year. However, there is ebbs and flows here, right? We're assuming a straight line approach. You could have 1 year where you're back up to 300, and then 1 year you're down to 50. So again, this is a forecast. Actuals may vary and should be monitored every year.
Councillor Miller has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I want to jump in before you get into all the numbers, because this question, and you do talk about it on the one slide, but only on that one, and that is on inflation. So we're on growth and assessment. The average annual growth and assessment over the forecast period is 1.9%. Now that's without inflation, correct?
That's correct.
So I'm just, but you did mention inflation in the other metrics, and are we going to? I'm hoping we're comparing apples to apples. You know what I mean? So.
Understood. Through the chair. So just a comment on that. Just as an FYI, MPAC has still not updated any assessment value since 2016. So for us to forward forecast a increase to the assessment value, we may be overstating it at some point. Now, again, this is all estimates at the end of the day. But if we forecast a higher assessment than what you may potentially get because they hold assessment values constant, let's say for another couple of years, then we may be overstating your potential tax revenues.
Okay.
So
for growth and assessment, we are not going to include inflation, and you did that when you did your final calculations.
That's correct.
Okay. I was wondering when I read that this afternoon. Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Kyle has a question before we.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor, through you. And just a quick question, like Councilor Miller, before you get too far. When you talked about the population growth projection, I'm just curious, we're seeing a lot more like multi-generational families moving into one home. And it doesn't really reflect that necessarily in the numbers. So I'm just wondering how we account for that, where, you know, maybe the average is going to be higher than 3.08 people per single family home.
Great question, Councillor, through the chair. Again, these are the assumptions that we have to think about as to what to include. If we do include a higher population per persons per unit, for example, now we're deviating from a study that was just released that actually said this was the growth forecast over the next 10 years. So for us to then say, well, we had a study that was just done 3 months ago and then completely changed the population numbers, don't think it would be at least proper in this scenario. Now, having said that, things change, fairly quickly. So this is something that would need to be monitored, obviously on an annual basis through the budget process and approvals by council prior to you passing your tax rates. But again, this is grounded on information that's known at a point in time.
Councillor Pierce and then Councillor Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Kyle just took my question because when we were here and we were talking, when we were doing the development charges, that was one of the things that I brought up is the fact that having this 3-person per unit is not reality. I know we had a discussion around with that and you advised us how you come up with those numbers. And okay, fine for that. But for something like this, when we're talking a long-term financial plan, I'm struggling that we still have the same numbers there. And I appreciate the fact that, deviating the numbers from what was just passed 3 months ago would look strange, so to speak. But you did mention the fact that, we need to review this every year and stuff like that. I would even go so far as to suggest that in the 3 months since we've spoken of the development charges, there has been more multi-generation families move into the area, which is going to, influence those numbers again. I think we're cutting ourselves short by only having the 3 there. But just a comment, and I appreciate your response back to Councillor Kyle. And I think it's something that now there's several of us that are bringing up the same thing here. So I just wanted to comment on that.
And Councillor Oakley before you.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Mayor, just to comment on that, and let me know if I'm getting too far away from the actual thing in front of us. But I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, during that study that was recently done, I believe these are actually increased assumptions per unit based on trying to correct for that matter, and whether or not we can argue whether or not those are still conservative numbers on what to expect per unit. But I believe it was an increase in assumption of persons per unit versus our previous development charges study. Is that a correct understanding?
Through the chair, I'll have to take a look just to for sure because I don't have it right in front of me. But keep in mind when we look at these persons per unit that were included as part of this analysis, as well as the DC, we have 2 sets of persons per unit numbers. One is your current population, which would have been existing, and then through working with the planning staff as well as the work with our firm, we then take a look at what is the person per unit for every new home. So there are those 2 numbers between existing versus new. Now I don't have the study in front of me, so I'll have to take a look at what that is. But I'm happy to provide that information to staff, through council. Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. So now going into the operating revenues and expenditures. So when we were going through the information, as I mentioned, I'll break this down into about 3 different components. Again, I won't go into the gory details of each line item, but at least to provide you a bit of an overview of how the summaries were generated. But essentially, when looking at an operating budget, the 3 main components really are the operating expenditures, pure operating. So this is like your day-to-day, salaries, benefits, all of rent, hydro, mortgage, etc. Versus what's capital-related operating expenditures, again, going to debt, going to the capital levy, and then we have your operating revenues, right? And then the revenues could be broken down into non-tax versus your tax rates, but for all intents and purposes, we're talking about the non-tax revenue. So just what is the forecast over that next 10 years. So in this slide here, it does show the pure operating expenditures potentially anticipated over the next 10 years. And when looking at your draft operating budget that was proposed, by staff, we look at the numbers net of any reserve transfers of debt charges. Because remember, I'm classifying that as capital. And for 2025, they are forecasted to increase by about 9.9%. However, when we're looking at now the long-term financial plan, again, because of different inflationary factors, interest rates seem to be coming down almost every other quarter, back to somewhat of a norm. But again, this is something where, no one really has a crystal ball to try to figure out exactly where interest rates may land. We've assumed over this long period, this 10-year period of at least a 3% inflation for the operating budget. Now, again, as I mentioned, this is a assumption, and this would need to be monitored on an annual basis. And as part of that analysis, I mentioned that we also include that additional operating expenditures associated with growth. So with that being said, when we were looking at the growth forecasts relative to the cost per capita per employee, so new people and new employees that would come to the county, we did estimate that for that forecast that we're looking at approximately $1.4 million per year in additional operating expenditures, and that's actually an additional $1.4 million every year. So in year 2, it'll be that initial 1.4 plus another 1.4, so 2.8. So you'll see that on the right-hand side in the graph, the blue being your existing operating expenditures, and then the green, being the growth in your existing operating expenditures, that 3%, and then that purple sliver above, that is that additional, $1.4 million every year because of growth alone. So when looking at this again, using an average, because this will spike, it'll go up and down. There's going to be changes, but when looking at this on an average basis, this is roughly about 4.5% per year. Now, obviously, I just mentioned we had the 9%, almost 10% in 2025. We're assuming 3%. So again, this will averaging over 10 years. It's something that we just have to do in order to smooth the rates, because we're not sure exactly, is it going to be cyclical, or you're going to have 10% every couple of years. It's something that's much more difficult to forecast. In terms of your non-tax revenues associated with your operating, we did a similar analysis with respect to the expenditure side, and looking at your existing non-tax revenues, it actually increased by about 8.5%, in 2025. So it's about 1.5% less than your operating expenditure increase. However, again, typically revenues don't go up 1-to-1 with expenditures. And looking at the incremental growth-related revenues that we're potentially estimating over that next 10 years, we're also assuming 3.9% actually over the whole period. So when you combine your inflation for the existing operating revenues as well as that new incremental amount, so just under 4% per year in this case. Oops. On Earth. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. So with that being said, now we go into your capital expenditures and forecasts. Now, keep in mind, again, I'll say this again, this does exclude the water and wastewater. However, I did note it at the bottom of this page just to provide you a bit of an overview as to what your actual capital expenditures are anticipated at over that next 10-year period. So looking at your capital forecasts, over the next 10 years, especially on the tax-supported services, it is estimated that there's about just over $482 million worth of capital that is anticipated to occur. Now, of that amount, you can see here that the capital forecast for the 2025 capital levy is about 16.8 million. So this is what was proposed as part of the budget. So I believe it was like 16.775 or something, rounding. And you can see that's where we start actually increasing that amount in 2026. And then it goes down slightly. And you'll see in the following graph, the following table, that the amounts on a per year basis, there's quite a bit really in the first few years, and then it normalizes somewhat in the latter half of the forecast. But one thing I would point out is when you're looking at this with respect to your water and wastewater capital, that's another $317 million. So over a 10-year period, we potentially have an estimated grand total of just under $800 million worth of capital, which is a sizable amount, especially when they're trying to do a task of putting together a long-term financial plan. Now, that $317 million, that'll get rationalized through that water and wastewater rate study. But again, it's estimated that the findings of that, I mean, I'm sure you don't want to, you'll have to really examine the type of rate increases you'd like to look at from the water and wastewater standpoint in order to help fund this capital program. Now, I would like to keep in mind too that this capital amount includes development charge projects. So when we go to the next slide, there's a number of funding sources where not everything is hitting the tax rates or the water and wastewater rates. So from a tax supported perspective, that $482 million, you can see that there's quite a bit of funding sources that we've identified. Starting from the top, you can see in 2025, for example, we have just under $43 million worth of capital that's tax supported. Well, of that amount, it's assumed that just under 4.7 million would come from the capital reserves. Then we have some allocation from your parkland dedication reserves. And then we have your gas tax or Canada Community Build Fund. We have some OSIF funding as well, and then we have some development charge utilization, which is about just over $11 million. However, there is still a gap that won't be fully funded from these amounts, and you'll see here that we are still assuming just under $1.9 million worth of debt. And then we also have some transfers from the operating. So this is your capital related operating budget where we're transferring to the capital levy. And that's about $16.8 million, 16,775. However, we do have just under $2.7 million as well from grants, donations, or any other revenue sources that's not identified above. Now, I'm not going to go through every single line here and column. However, I just like to point out that once you get into 2026 and then 2027, you can see how that capital program just increased from 40 million to over $71 million. And then in 2027, while not as high, it's still about $66 million. Whereas the average of this 10-year period is roughly about $45 million per year. So in those 2 years particularly, we're already going above that average if you were to straight line this.
If I could just stop you for a moment, please. Councillor Bell has a question.
Yes, thank you, sir. Through to Byron. First, an observation based on some experience of business planning in the past that your comment about capital reducing after 2027 is as much our inability to see the future as reality. So I think we need to be thoughtful about that we just can't see what's coming, but it will come, and that's what happens. Second question is more of a technical one. In the last couple of years, we've approved a lot of money for spending on, for example, Grand River Street North refurbishment, and the library has got money associated with it. How do we see that playing through in this table?
Great question. Through the chair. So this capital program is based on the capital forecast that was provided via staff's work. So I'll have to take a look at the details of exactly what was included, because there's a lot of line items. But if those particular projects were identified, then they would flow here with respect to, this is only for new capital. So this is from anything that potentially is within your 10-year forecast. If you're talking about any capital that's already existing, or some items that have been projects completed, but maybe there's a debt component to them. That's shown separately as debt
So
payments.
just to be clear, these are projects that are not completed, but we have assigned money in previous budgets for these projects. So let me take Grand River Street North. We've got, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 roundabouts and a lot of road work to do. And we put money aside in previous budgets. We haven't spent it yet. We will be spending it this year, next year, the year after. How does that show up in this forecast of spend or of capital?
Yeah, great question. Through the chair, my understanding is if there are any approved projects that, let's say, you have been saving up for, then it would show up as a transfer from that capital reserve. So if you were putting money away historically, perhaps in a capital reserve, then that capital reserve line is now the utilization of those funds.
So then let me ask you a question of staff, if I may, Mr. Mayor. Have we put that money in a capital reserve?
The forecast shows all the projects that we've already approved for budget. So like any debt that we just haven't incurred yet, it's built into the forecast to be spent. So it's not like there's a whole bunch of money that we haven't accounted for. This is what he's presenting right now is just the go forward projects. And there are a few, I think in 2025, maybe even 2026 that are related to Grand River Street North, but past budget allocations for that are already built into the base position.
But we haven't spent the money yet.
No, but it's built into our base position as a committed, like the money's committed, funded. If it's going to be funded by debt, it's already calculated into our debt.
In one of these debt lines in debentures, would I see a spike at some point where we actually do take the debenture on and start spending money?
Not in the capital. It will come in. The debt repayments will come into the operating at some point.
So I would see it
but the capital is already in. It's already accounted for in the forecast.
I'd see it in the debt repayments in the operating line.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Miller.
One observation, it looks like the levy is going to be huge in 2026 based on this. Is that a correct assessment if you were?
Sometimes a question is a good segue to the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'll leave it at that, and we'll segue in a second. I want to ask the DCs, development charges. We have a potential prime minister who thinks municipalities need to do away with their DC so that we can encourage more building. That's just a game changer. That would change everything, yes?
Through the chair, I mean, that's correct. I mean, that observation is, if there is if there is an appetite for, the potential change of government at the federal side. I know he's been expressive, through his interviews, podcasts, etc. However, I would keep in mind that the Development Charges Act is under the provincial legislation. So some of the talking points, again, this is just my opinion now, not necessarily reflective of this, is that, the way that potentially that could be rolled out is through different types of reductions, perhaps in transfer payments that the federal government provides to municipalities. So when with respect to the actual Development Charges Act, I mean, really it's a separated entity because it is through the province. Now, having said that, I also heard, again, listening through some of those conversations, is that, it's probably more in that, year 4, year 5, and near the end of the start of that term. Again, this is all now, potential because nothing has happened yet. We're still in the current government as it stands. And really the potential here is that could be an impact is you would only try to look at then the sources of funding that you're getting from the federal government, right? Because if it's anything that's related to the province or any other internal funding, presumably that would not be affected at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to pick your brain on that, so appreciate it. Thank you.
So this just provides more of a graphical.
Sorry, I didn't see Councillor Chambers' hand go up.
That's because it just went up almost too late. I'm just wondering if you want to comment on what Councillor Bell said, because I think he's very, very correct. The tax-supported capital cost in 2033 or 2032 is a lot lower than it is in 2026. And Councilor Bell is saying, I think quite correctly, that one of the reasons is we just haven't thought of what we're going to do in 2033. If I look back, and I know I can find this, if I went back 10 years to 2016 and looked at a forecast, I am sure that the 2026 would be a lot lower than it is on this starting point. So how do you rationalize that in your bottom line forecasting? Because if that's correct, that maybe 2032 and 2033 might be 81 and 87 rather than 51 and 40, like that, I think is more a real thing than what is on here, because we just haven't thought of that yet. In 2016, I don't think we were thinking about redoing Grand River Avenue to the extent that we're doing it. So I'm just wondering if you comment on that.
Absolutely. Through the chair. So as of right now, I just like to point out, I just like to preface that the information here is contained within the proposed 10-year capital budget. So, for us to, just artificially add a number to increase it because we want to smooth it out to maybe 70 million a year, that would, to me, would be a bit improper unless there's some type of, analysis at least to inform that's the case. Maybe there's an asset, a master plan that says, well, we have some items that are probably coming up in years, in the latter half. It could be potentially undertaken sooner depending on, the condition. So maybe that's the case. So this right here is just based on the capital program. However, you're right. You're completely correct that, there are some external factors and, unforeseen circumstances where, in 2030, that 35 million could potentially be, 50, 60 million or more. Now, having said that though, where municipalities have the ability then to help plan for that is not necessarily increasing the, the capital spend, but it's more prudent planning of putting away the money in your reserve funds. So instead of showing it as a capital budget increase, you'd now show a higher contribution to your reserves. And then now that you're building up that buffer in your reserve funds, now if there's any unforeseen expenditures, you can now draw upon those reserves and then pay for that to minimize debt. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have something where it's just, an extremely unknown cost, and then all of a sudden the cost of materials are back to COVID times where everything was, 3, 4, 5 times the cost, it's very hard to shy away from having to do any debt financing because you may just not have the money all at once. But a good way to at least keep that buffer is to build up your reserves. And that actually helps assist with smoothing out the tax rate increases. Because if you recall, I told you what we're about to present, it's just the unfiltered amount based on the expenditures per year. So you may have some years that the tax rate goes down, some years the tax rate goes up. However, a good way to make sure you stabilize that is maybe for the years that it's going down, you transfer, that difference into your reserve funds. So then that way you're at least building that up over time, and then at least streamlining your tax rate increases potentially. Again, there's a number of factors that we can do, and I'll present that actually as part of my observations after this slide.
Any other questions? Okay.
So in terms of the,
Now, just to build upon the comment that Councillor Chambers mentioned, in the 2022 budget for capital, we had 666,717,000. We're now up to 108 in the coming budget. There seems to be only one direction of travel. And if you start to look at what we assumed for 2025, year ago, you start to see that number creeping up. So there's just I don't know, it's a law of physics or whatever, but it seems to be that's the way it goes.
So in terms of the, just on a graphical sense for that capital related expenditure, so this is again just related to the new capital that's being proposed over the 10-year period. And this one does not include any approved capital that's already been earmarked as part of our base numbers. But you can see here, for example, like in 2025, really what's being funded from the operating budget is roughly about $25.22 million. And if you look at 2025, again, the capital levy transfer is about $16.775 million. We're also transferring just under $4 million to your capital reserves. We also have debt charges that we're paying for, roughly about $3.8 million. And then we have some prior existing capital as well that we're earmarking some of those funds, just under $450,000. And then you'll see we also have an operating reserves transfer. And typically what you would use the operating reserves for, any miscellaneous operating costs. Maybe you could use it as well as a rate stabilization in some years. Again, there's different uses of that, and that's why there's a transfer every year. I would note, if you take a look at 2026, you can see the capital levy does go up to just under $25 million. However, that's not the line item I'd like you to look at. It's really that debt charge amount. You can see it goes from 3.8 to 6.6 million. So as Ms. Boyd had said earlier, any approved budgets that are now pending debt financing, presumably if it's going to be done this year, your first payment will be for next year. Hence, you went from 3.8 to 6.6 million. That's what we wanted to show on this slide, based on your comments, Councillor. And you can see that kind of continues on. However, it starts cascading down over time, because you do have some legacy debt that will be coming off the books, because it's now been 10, 20, 25 years on some of those items. However, we are still hovering at that $6 million mark, to 2034. So in terms of the tax rate impacts, and I promise I only have a few slides left, the summary of the operating budget you could see here just really goes to show, all the information that was just presented in the preceding slides. So I'll start off with the purple shading. So that really is the operating expenditures. So this incorporates your existing operating as well as the inflationary increases and the increase in that incremental growth. So you can see that's increasing roughly from $109 million in 2025 to just under $155 million in 2034. The capital related expenditures, that's that teal color just above the purple. And that's increasing roughly from $25 million to $32 million in 2034. But again, this changes depending on the level of capital that's being paid for, at least accommodated through the operating budget. And then lastly, we have your non-tax revenues. Again, it's a nominal increase, a steady increase, I should say, over the 10-year period. However, this is the amount that potentially would come from other sources to help pay for your operating expenditures. And you'll see on the screen the white arrow between the top of the teal and the bottom and the top of the non-tax revenues is really the net levy requirement. So the difference between the two, that's what we're including as part of your calculations for your tax rates. Now, I'll show the tax rates in a moment. However, just wanted to point out that for the base case, which again, this is just looking at your current operating budgets, your capital budgets, we are trying to align with staff's proposed numbers that were provided to council, which again, you are making some decisions in the coming weeks. And you can see here that with 2025 as our starting point, really the forecast here is for 2026 to 2034. Now, should there be any changes to the proposed operating and capital, that's before you from staff's reports, that will impact the calculation. So we'll just have to make any adjustments really just subsequent to that decision point. You can see in the green, this is where I say that this green line represents that unsmooth annual increases. I'll show you what the increases are in the next slide. However, just to point out that at least for 2025, based on that operating and the capital budgets and all the different transfers, it is estimated to be about 6.2% on top of your 2024 tax rates. Now, there is this opportunity which I mentioned earlier where you wouldn't want that ebb and flow of maybe tax rates going up one year, tax rates going down. You want to be at least more predictable and constant where possible. There are a number of ways that we could do that. Either we smooth out the capital program by perhaps delaying non-priority projects so that way it's a little bit more even throughout the year. We could also reevaluate, the use of reserves, to potentially drop down some of the added expenditures in any given year, or we utilize debt as an instrument to help, really streamline the approach. Because with debt, although yes, you are paying an interest and financing costs with it, you know what the payments are every year, so you actually smooth that out over a period of time. So it is a tool. However, I would say that with this capital program, as well as what you've approved over the last year or two, you already are incurring a large capital debt payment, as you saw in the prior slide, of going up to about $6 million per year. Yes.
Councillor Miller and Councillor Bell.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Through the presenter. The 6.2% tax increase, that's unsmooth. That's just the capital levy increase, correct?
Through the chair, no, this is the tax rate. So that 6.2% is whatever your tax rate's in 2024 plus 6.2%. So I believe the tax rate's about sorry, I have it in my other. It's just over basically from 0.98 to and then plus 6%. So I believe it's just over 1% on your tax rate.
Okay.
So it's an increase from your 2024 tax rate by 6.2% to a 2025 tax rate.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bell.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that, if I may, Mr. Mayor. That 6.2 is what we had in our budget binders, I think. Look to Heather to nod and say yes, but it does exclude decision packages. So that wasn't my question. If I could go back one slide, Byron, if I may. So the net levy there, that's really interesting numbers. In your table there, when we go from 2025 to 2034, we go from 85 million to 120, about a 50% increase in 9 years. Since between 2020 and 2025, we've gone up 51%. So this tells me that you think we're going to slow down in terms of building net levy. And perhaps it just plays to the point that Councillor Chambers and I made, that you can't really forecast the tail end of this very well. But the history, and I think when we do budgeting, and I've said this to Alison before, it's always good to look back before you look forward. Our history is we average 10% per year on net levy. So if you start from where you are now, that 85 million or 77 million, then in 10 years' time we're looking at not 120 but 150. And it's one of the beauties of a model like this. You can actually say, well, what happens if it is 154 and not 120? What's happened to the tax rates in between? So that's one of the real beauties of having this model. We need to be grounded in this one, that our history tells us it's about 10% per year we're growing.
No,
Councillor Oakley has a question for you.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Mr. Tan here. Now this table on the tax rate forecast page, base case, is there a tabulation of these tax rates, and what number do we end up here at the end of the 10-year forecast? And additionally, is this tax rate here, is that just the residential tax rate as per our municipal tax rate, or is that the actual factoring in the school board rate as well?
Great question. So just for your second question, this is just the municipal tax rate. There's no school board here. And sorry, could you repeat the first question?
Yeah, is this actual information tabulated anywhere in your report here, or do you have what number we're ending at here?
No, so through the chair, we did not include that in here because the unsmooth tax rate isn't exactly something what you could pass. You would want to do a smooth rate. Yeah. So that's something where, if you look at the actual chart here, I mean, you can see right now you're roughly at around 1%, just under 1%. It's actually 0.98 or something like that for 2024, potentially going up to just over 1%. And you can see in 2027 it actually balloons up to 1.23%, comes back down, goes back up to just about 1.25%. So because we didn't want to show you, it's okay, well, why is it bouncing around so much? Okay. So we are going to show you the potential increases or decreases per year, similar to that 6.2%. However, really just based on, what you as a council consider for February through the budgets, then we would then show you, here's the actual percentage for each year. Because now we would know exactly how you'd like to smooth this out based on, do we transfer more money into debt? Do we run a scenario where, as the councilor said, we do that 10% because, that's really what historically has occurred. So there's a number of factors there. So to show you this, where it goes up and down, it would look a little bit confusing.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
And I just want to, just as a comment before I go to the next slide, and obviously we appreciate the comments because this is something that we want to do in order to be able to update the model the way that, you as a council see fit in order to what you want to pass for the municipality. But just as a comment is, again, just, my experience, especially over the last 3-4 years, you weren't alone in terms of the large increases for, for the tax rates. However, there is this little thing called COVID that occurred over that last 3 or 4 years where a lot of material costs, a lot of operating costs, it just shot up through the roof, especially with freight, logistics. So, having said that, to maintain those levels, I think it'd be good from a financial planning of putting that money away into a reserve fund to help pay for everything. However, at the same time, it's really a matter of how much does council want to include in order to have that rainy day? Because we want to keep it at 10%. However, you're not experiencing 10% worth of expenditures, then are we putting that difference within a reserve fund so that at least just in case something becomes 130 million, well, at least we have the money in the bank. So really it's, it's your decision, at that point, and, we're here to provide that support.
Councillor Chambers.
I'm just going to ask the question through you to the presenter, and probably the general manager and the treasurer might want to respond as well. And I might be off base on this, but and it relates to the smoothing the increases, and you're suggesting that you've listed 3 ways to do that: use of reserves, reevaluate project timing, and use of debt. Historically and traditionally, we do delay things. That's a tool we've used quite often in the past, and we have quite often in the past used reserves when we around the table talking about budgets. So we'll take something to continue to keep the tax rate low and that kind of stuff. One thing we haven't done a lot of, at least maybe openly, is the use of debt to lower, borrow when the tax rate is high and pay it back when the operating isn't. That's tricky, because if you keep going on like we've been talking about with Councilor Bell and I've been talking, at the end of the day, in 5 years, 6 years, we just keep going up and we don't have them rainy day years where we can pay the debt down. So the use of debt to moderate the tax increase is a real good tool to use if we can condition ourselves to put it back when times are better. I'm just wondering if you can comment on that from a historical perspective from the staff. We haven't done that a lot, and whether we should be doing that and what we have to be cognizant of if we want to do that.
Yeah, so in terms of debt, we do have to be careful because there's only certain things we're allowed to debt finance. We can't debt finance our operations, our salaries and things like that. So I would say that we actually have debt financed a lot of projects to allow us to get a lot of work done in the municipality over the years, to the point where we're actually very, very close to our self-imposed annual repayment limits. So I don't know that moving a bunch of capital projects into more debt is necessarily going to make for a much smoother, without having some back-end implications. You'll see part of my report, one of the things that this whole project has really brought to light is a need for us to revisit our studies and our projects, and kind of take a look at everything, not just keep pushing things back, but really think about when we are going to move forward with some of these projects. What are these projects? What are other alternate funding opportunities for some of these projects? And really looking at the projects themselves in the capital plan. And in terms of tools, Yeah, reserves are obviously something that we do historically every year, kind of look at some point in the budget, and then the impact the next year's budget. But you know, that's what we do as a smoothing tool right now. In terms of other smoothing tools, there's things to be considered, but I do think it starts with taking a better look at the capital project and when something else is presented to us as a new project. And one of those, as we know, everything 5 years from that, we don't know what we don't know in terms of what's coming forward, but we need to use this model to look at those a lot more closely as to, okay, we can do this, but maybe we don't want to do this then. Maybe we want to do it then. And this is the long-term impact of what that project will do to our situation. Because I think a lot of times, you know, we're just driven by the growth, or, you know, we need to do this now, and now we need to do this, and we just put it in and it goes forward, and we don't take that time to really model out what some of these projects are going to mean in terms of impacts.
Councillor Chambers?
I just want to respond to that because that is really relying on reevaluating project timing. And that's, I think, a typical, it's nothing wrong with it, it's good. A typical treasury thing to do is to tell council, don't spend so much money. And because we don't want to borrow and we don't want to use the reserves. And I think that's probably good advice. And I'm just wondering, again, with looking at transferring from operating, we're suggesting about 16 million this year from operating to capital. And next year, it's 24 million. And that really is something we should look at and say, hey, maybe I don't think we have that much money to put into the capital, so we got to do something. I think that the Treasury is telling us to look at the projects we've got lined up with all our master planning and all the things we're supposed to be doing according to these master plans. Maybe we're master planning ourselves into a situation where we're running out of money.
And sorry, through the mayor, the other piece that doesn't come across great in terms of like a forecast, in terms of like a straight line forecast, is things like provincial grants, federal grants, things like that we have been fairly successful for to project some projects forward at a much lower cost. So when we get those, that changes a lot of the funding model for how things are funded, and it's allowed us to do a lot more, and it's kind of helped. But as well as a finance group, we're not going to throw in a bunch of potential grants into, you know, we know the ones that we think we know, but we're not putting in a whole bunch that, you know, we think that the Paris wastewater treatment plant is going to get a 50% grant. We're not going to put that into our funding models, but it is certainly something that, you know, that we can look at. Maybe some projects only go forward if we get a grant, or maybe the timing of them depends on, you know, grant availability, things like that. Those are the kind of policies and processes that I'm looking at bringing forward in the next year or so.
Ms. Newton.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. Heather really touched on what I was going to say when she wrapped up there. So it's not just the project timing. It is from a policy perspective, what can we maybe implement? And one of the things that I was talking about when I did my initial presentation at the beginning of budget was the Brant Sports Complex, and that we moved that to 2026. However, if the grants that are applied for did come through, we can always bring a mid-year report and move that timing up based on that new information of grant funding that reduced or minimized the impact to 2025. So again, it sort of plays into timing, but it also maybe reevaluates some of the triggers that we've at least traditionally relied on in terms of when a project's initiated.
Councillor Bell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just building on what Alison said and what Heather said, I like the thought of putting a little bit more conservatism into our assumptions about grants. And there are municipalities that will actually say, you do not move forward on this project until you have the grant. And we're in a bit of a limbo, potentially, with a library, where it's dependent, the economics on that and the burden on the taxpayer is hinged on whether or not we get large fundraising, but also large grants. And I think when we deliberate on that next week, it should come into the conversation. But going forward, I think the point Alison makes about changing our policies, I think we do need to reflect on that over the next year.
So the last option that just want to present here again, as I mentioned earlier, is working with county staff to try to determine how much money could we build a hospital reserve fund based on adding a 1% net levy on top of that, let's say 6.2%. That's being proposed for 2025, and then for any subsequent increases, add another 1% in future years. And with that being said, again, you'll see that this graph kind of looks like if you were to superimpose this on the prior page, it'll be just 1% higher for the most part. Well, with some deviation in some years, just because it's a different scenario. But essentially, the punchline here is that over a 10-year period, we could potentially contribute about $56 million into a reserve fund. Just by adding that one additional percent on top of the any approved tax levies. Now, this $56 million does not include any interest allocations as well. So obviously, over time, as you're putting this in a reserve fund, there's investments. So this hopefully within the 10 years, balloons well in excess of the $60+ million mark. With interest. Now, in terms of the summary of the tax rates between the two, again, to show you the actual tax rate, whether it's 1%, 1.2, 1.25, really, again, because it's unsmooth, I mean, these really probably won't be the tax rates that, that we would be putting together as part of the report. It will be based on what would you like to see as the mechanism to at least help smooth out the tax rates. However, when looking at the increases, and you can kind of allude to based on one of the councillors' comments on the capital levy increasing in 2026, you can see how that 6.2% in 2025 goes up to 12.7% in 2026, and then it drops down to an increase of 6.4%. But then in 2028, because we're not adding any additional transfers to reserves, this is just a pure operating capital. Potentially, it could go down by negative 5.9%, and you can see how it kind of ebbs and flows. So this is something where we would work with the county staff, depending on what the outcome is of the council for your budgets, to assist in smoothing this out for a potential increase over the next 10 years, with 2025 being what you approve. So just a couple of slides, just some observations based on the proceeding. As I mentioned, the tax-supported capital program averages to that $48 million per year. I already made that comment earlier that, really in 2026 and 27, those are the peak, capital expenditures, at least anticipated, at $71 million and $66 million respectively, which again surpasses that 48 million annual average. So something to consider when looking at your forecasts. Now, the contributions towards the hospital, as I mentioned, we added that as a scenario or an option. So this is something where, this is an item that you would like to include. Obviously, we would model that, or we've already have. And really looking at that, this is a high-level draft analysis as of now, until we obviously get the direction in February as to what you're approving for 2025. So really, this is something where the annual tax rates and capital budgets, you're going to review this on an annual basis, right? This is going to be a tool to at least help forecast any potential changes in revenues or expenditures. However, it's not saying once we put it in here, you're locked in. Any changes, like the councillor said, with any grant funding, any changes to, debt levels, monies coming in from other sources, that'll obviously change the forecast annually. And this is something that needs to be monitored. So strategies for reducing some of the tax rate impacts. Again, I think we've all said it, but really it's assessing that 10-year capital. Again, is there ways to smooth it out, maybe put some of the larger components, delaying it? Now, keep in mind, I would like to point out that perhaps the delays would be for non-priority projects, because hence the name. If it's a priority project, I don't think you want to delay something where it becomes a number of potholes or whatever the case may be. So it really it's looking at that lens as to what potentially could be moved versus what is really a priority. Whereas unless everything is a priority, obviously in the next 10 years. And then we'll utilize debt financing again. That's one potential option. You do have a self-imposed 15% debt capacity limit, as Ms. Boyd had mentioned. So this is something where, as of right now, you're just under 14% in your current ARL, your current limit. So we already are nearing that 15% amount. Now, keep in mind the province does have that legislated 25% own revenue limit. Now, there are municipalities, again, that have surpassed that for extenuating circumstances. Particularly, there's one example in Central Ontario where they had to go above and beyond that 25% because they had catastrophic failures in their wastewater. So again, because they had to do the work, they requested that the province increase that to over 25%. I think they went up to as high as 38%, just because they had to take care of an emergency. But in your case, over the forecast period, we are assuming that you are about to approach that 25% mark. Now, it will be over 20% in some future years. You could see how it went up to that $6 million amount. And this will change depending on the assumptions on the debt, right? As of right now, based on the rates from IO, it's roughly anywhere from just over 4%, 4.24, 4.44%. In the next 2 to 3 years, who knows what that rate will be. If it's coming down, then obviously that allows for more borrowing power, right? So things change, but as of right now, we are going to potentially be over that 20% mark, approaching your 25% limit. And then as well, you also have funds within your Brant County Power. Recognizing that you are utilizing the interest rates, interest that's gained from that reserve fund to help contribute to your operating budget. So this is something where, right now it is assisting with as that non-tax revenues to help pay for your operating expenditures. But there is a large balance there. So this is something where council would have to make a decision. Do we keep that as kind of our ongoing support to the operating budget? Or is that something that you want to maybe reconsider and do something else? I'll leave it at that. Now, in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, these are the draft findings based on the information we have right now. This will potentially change come February, depending on the outcome of your budget deliberations. And as well, upon the completion of your water and wastewater rate study, the findings of that really can then be joined, with the tax-supported side, so that we can get a holistic view of all of your capital and operating budgets. Again, we estimated the debt on the water and wastewater side, but things may change once that study actually progresses. So, as I said, after this, we will revise the tax-supported forecasts based on the approved amounts. If there are any directions for any capital revisions, obviously that's something we will, re-examine, and any other items that council may direct that you want to revise. But other than that, the scenario here is what we've provided based on the work with staff to date. And that concludes my presentation.
Questions? Councillor Bell.
Thank you. When you talked about strategies for reducing tax rate, the one thing you didn't say was reduce services, which I think in my 6 years on council, we have not done. And I can't speak for those that have been on council longer than I have, whether we've ever reduced services. No, I didn't think we had. So I think it's a pretty, it's a good place to start that we're not going to reduce services. So that kind of pushes us in the direction of other things. Could I have a couple of questions about assumptions in your capital forecast? Did you assume anything for affordable housing?
And sorry, through the chair, in what respect?
Was that in the capital? Was that in the DC? It wasn't in the DC charges because we can't charge for affordable housing. Where do we include the cost of our share of meeting the affordable housing target?
the Trillium Way piece is in the plan as part of the projection for debts. Any other projects we do would once again be proposed to be modeled through this and considered accordingly when we have our project in hand.
So they're not in here at the moment. That's what I'm
No,
saying.
because we don't have any projects that are ready to.
But we know we have an obligation, moral or not, to cough up another $22 million, or the equivalent of 93 units of affordable housing in 5 years, in the next 5 years.
Alison?
Through your worship, to Councillor Bell, so staff will be bringing a further report forward in 2025. We're actually going to look at more specifics. I'll give an example. We have no approved affordable housing projects beyond Trillium Way. However, there are different options and ways that could play out financially. So if we were to look at modular housing, which is relatively new in the market, for example, it would change a lot of the assumptions that we've discussed in previous years that make up that figure you just presented. So I think we need to look at that in much further detail and do some analysis on what we could possibly do and when that would play out. But we are working on that, and we will be bringing a report forward later this year that will talk about more specifics and what year we can expect to see that in.
I'm very pleased to hear that, but I guess from the perspective of this study, the answer is there's nothing in there. Second one was, is there anything in there for the new fire station, or the thoughts of a new fire station in the south end of Paris? And with it, and while you're thinking about that, is there anything there for moving to full-time, look at Cindy now, full-time fire staff, which was in the fire master plan, I think, that we, talking about master plans again, that we supported some time ago.
The southwest possible fire station, that I believe is a DC project, so it would have been captured in here, in whatever the amount was for that DC project. I can say that the full-time fire.
I couldn't see it in the 10-year capital forecast, but no.
It's likely in a post period for the DC, so it's down the road a bit, but it's not projected by 2033.
Is that right? I thought that was going to come much sooner, that we were going to move to have a fire station in the south end of town before that time.
Through your worship, excuse me, I'll let Cindy speak to this in a little bit more detail, but I believe if that were the scenario, it would also be a consolidation. So I think there should be some offsetting revenue in that if we were to do it prior to that period that Heather's alluded to. But I'll let Cindy elaborate on that.
Cindy, you have to go to the podium to speak. Can you come over to the podium?
I can.
Yeah, I think council asked that we speak from the podium.
Oh, Brian said you could see her over there.
Just to clarify, Mr. Mayor, when I brought that up, it wasn't that they have to speak when they present reports.
Okay.
They can answer questions. I don't mind that, but when they present a report is why it was.
Well,
You're there now, Cindy, so
you need to be more clear, councillor, and she's there now, so we're going to let her speak from the podium. Unless you want her to sit back down, it's up to you.
Thank you. I'm getting my exercise, so it's a win-win. As Heather mentioned, I know that we did include the South Paris headquarters in the DC study. We also, I know through conversations, looked at future staffing and full-time staffing. It has been quite some time since I've looked at that data. Unfortunately, I don't have a specific answer tonight, but I can go back and look at it.
That's okay. Thank you, Cindy. I have a comment, but I'll save it for you.
All right, Councillor Chambers is next. Councillor Bell, I think you've had 3 speaking opportunities. Thank you. Councillor Chambers.
Now that I'm clarifying things, I'm going to clarify something else. When John was talking about reducing services, I was shaking my head And I wanted that to be interpreted so that we've never done it for the 40 years I've been on council. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it. I'm saying that we've never done it. Maybe we should do it.
Councillor Bell, are you seeking your fourth speaking opportunity? No, you can go now. I don't think there's any other hands up, so.
Then thank you for that opportunity to speak for the fifth, sixth, seventh time. Thank you to staff for doing this. And it is and to Byron and the team. It's a tough job to start from nothing. And then we started talking about long-term financial plans when I first joined council in 2019, and then, as Byron said, COVID got in the way in all kinds of senses. But this is, we perhaps shouldn't call it a plan as so much as a model, and because the plan is you know, our budget is the plan for most of our time. But as a model, we can use it to test our assumptions. And one of the assumptions we might test is we don't actually grow our tax assessment by 1.9% per year. You know, the economy slows down, Trump causes all kinds of problems, it's only 1% or it's no percent. What happens then? You know, those are the things that we need to be able to understand. So using it as a tool to test the sensitivity of our financial sustainability, it's really important. What happens if the provincial government does reduce or remove DCs? I know it's not on their agenda yet, but they may be influenced to do it by federal government. I like the idea of building up reserves, and this model can show how we can do that and the impact it has on our tax rates. And I think one of the things that I didn't quite understand from this, but I hope that we will hear from our own economic development team. We have 6 million square feet of industrial lands in the, the northwest corner of the junction between the 403 and Rest Acres. And I don't know whether we have been optimistic enough in putting the gain in assessment we will get from that into this plan, or whether it's already there, or whether we're actually being too optimistic. So I think at some point in time, I would appreciate if council could be updated on the pace with which we think that area will be developed and the impact it would have on our ability to service both the needs of the county, but also perhaps some of the wants of the county.
Alison?
Thank you, through your worship, to Councillor Bell. It hasn't fully been presented yet, but development services staff have been working on growth tracker and modeling there. That's, I think, going to be a really useful tool, and it is exploring some of those impacts of industrial development. Right now, we've been quite conservative with those numbers, just given the hurdles that we've yet to get over in terms of our road infrastructure that's going to actually enable that to go forward. That being said, I think the next step that we'd at least begin working on in 2025 is going to be how we actually combine those tools and blend them together to actually be able to get some refined numbers as we move forward. I think both of them are fantastic tools that, you're correct, we haven't had before in the past, but we haven't yet gotten to the stage where we can actually start overlapping those respective tools and see what those numbers look like and what they do to influence one another. And one of them would be the assessment numbers for industrial and commercial. So absolutely, those are things that we're going to look at. We just haven't quite gotten to that stage yet.
Seeing no other questions, thank you for your presentation. And I'm seeking a mover to get this on the floor. Councillor Coleman, Councillor Oakley. We're just going to vote to receive this delegation as information. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. 6.2. Heather, you're going to... Now, Heather doesn't have a formal presentation, but she did give the report this afternoon. Everyone received the report. Are there questions to the report? Councillor House?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, through you to Heather. Within your report, you referenced the library project, and in the last agenda item, Councillor Bell was referencing our discussions that are going to be happening next week, and it's going to be a critical time for making decisions on the project. I'm wondering, like, we haven't yet seen the tender results. That's happening. I guess we'll see it in a report this Friday in advance of the meeting on Tuesday. I'm wondering, with that same timing, can we see something from you that shows us some funding models of best case, worst case scenario on, because I understand the more success we have with grants and fundraising, the less development charges we're eligible for, I think, if I understand that correctly. And I know there's a lot of moving pieces for it. So I'm just wondering if you want to touch on it a little bit tonight, but if you're going to be able to send something to us that shows us some best case and worst case scenarios.
So through the mayor, obviously that report is coming forward in your agenda this week. So we have been working on the models for that. We've been working on the models based on the assumptions that we had in the first time we approved it in terms of fundraising and grants being the two big pieces. We also have looked at the worst case scenario being that we get no grant and that we have just the funds we've already raised. So that's like the worst case. We've also looked at, we did make an application for a grant. We're looking at what it would look like if we're fully successful on that grant, as well as our fundraising goals as kind of like a best case scenario, based on what the tender results are showing at this time, and assumptions for where we think interest rates are going to be, and looking at a 2028 start of our debenture payments.
Since you spoke first, Councillor House, can I use you as a mover for this report? And then Councillor Oakley wants to speak and you'll be his secretary. Okay, Councillor Oakley.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to staff, the recommendation currently reads that council direction be given, or one of the clauses anyways, that council direction be given on incorporating the LTFB and or 2025 draft budget, a model for funding the local contribution to the hospital project. So am I understanding correctly that the suggestions in this report today, we're looking for direction tonight on which way to go, or would that be direction given on the 6th when we're making other decisions like budget packages, finalizing the budget, so on and so forth?
My hope was to get some feedback tonight in terms of to actually model out an actual budget impact and decision package for that, but certainly we can keep it on a more generic level if we need to.
On that topic, Beverly, if I may continue. In that regards then, in terms of options presented, I'm a big fan of 3, and I might even go a bit further to suggest a hybrid 3 option, being that option 3 suggests that we use the power fund towards our hospital contribution as a start to that, something that still accrues interest, as well as using the 1% levy, which we will decide when we get to February 6th. But I might suggest, because we have this other sort of elephant in the room that Councillor Bell mentioned earlier, and is mentioned in this report about the affordable housing piece, that we might, instead of putting the full $30 million, I believe it's roughly $30 million of the Brett Power Fund into this hospital contribution reserve, instead putting half that there, half of it towards the affordable housing. That would also nicely, in terms of what would be in the reserve at the end of this budget period, put us at roughly the same $16 million that the city is at. So we're matching them dollar for dollar on what is available in that hospital reserve project. And I think that would demonstrate both our seriousness, put a decent sum of money in there that will accrue interest towards the project, as well as taking a decent chunk towards the $22.75 million that we have projected to need for the affordable housing. So that's just sort of speaking aloud my ideas there.
Thank you for that. Do you want to respond to that, or?
No, I'm happy to model out whatever council would like to consider. So, if, we can either put that on the floor, or we can just put out suggestions that you would like me to model. However, council would like to deal with it, we can bring those more exact numbers back.
Are there any questions? Any more questions for Heather? Seeing none. Do you want to make a motion? It's on
Well,
the
we have a
floor.
motion on the floor with
Yeah.
the recommendation, so I'm a little leery of how to do that, unless that just counts as, would I be making an amendment to make that the direction?
I think we can approve the motion and then do separate motions if you guys want to give direction on what to bring forward at the next meeting.
Councillor House?
Thanks. I agree that we should take what's here and vote on that first. We've got a motion and seconder. And I will point out that within the recommendation, it says staff be directed to further investigate all available funding sources for the development of municipally built affordable housing units. I think that encompasses what Councillor Oakley is trying to do in part.
Okay, Councillor Coleman?
Mr. Mayor, I just wonder if it'd be possible that all motions go up on the screen so we see what we're looking at and understand it exactly, because hearing it and not being able to see it are two different things.
The clerk is going to do that for you. Allison?
Thank you, through your worship. I believe staff have also presented a recommendation given the timing of all of this, that this report, we could have direction for this report to be received as information, and that staff come back with the modeling as suggested, the various scenarios to be considered on February the 6th.
Sounds right to me. Councillor Chambers?
That's my understanding, and I agree with Councillor House, but if Councillor Oakley is suggesting that we make that decision to use that is something that you just don't throw onto the table. We need to see the modeling. So I think the first, as Councillor House suggested, it's encompassed in the resolution that's before us. And when we see the modeling, then we can start talking about whether we should do this or that.
Councillor Oakley?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that is what I'm trying to express. I'm trying to understand exactly what the recommendation is asking, because it does specify within the one clause that we give direction tonight on what to do with the hospital. It's not more specific on the affordable housing unit side of things, but given that this is not an option on the table, thus asking for advice on how to bring that forward. If we're happy to do that, where I'm verbally suggested something, all models would be presented on the 6th. I'm more than happy with that. I'm not trying to blindside anyone with anything, obviously, just trying to move through our own process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Gary, can we put on the screen what's on the podium, please?
Can you make it a little bigger, someone? So Brian still can't see that. He wants to see something bigger than that.
Here, you're gonna have to do it. I don't know how to zoom. Oh, here it is.
It's in the, on the agenda.
Are you good with that, Brian? So it's on the floor and it has a seconder. When everyone's finished reading it, we'll call the vote. All those in favor? Opposed? I don't know where they are. Where's they're there? You're in favor, Christie, Councillor Garneau and Councillor Pierce? Yeah. Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you. That moves us on to number 7, which is next steps. And Heather's going to take us through that.
Thank you, Your Worship. So in terms of the long-term financial plan, next steps for that will be bringing forward those various models for consideration during our budget deliberations process. And then slowly starting to work through the list of policies that I named that we need to give some consideration to. So the implementation plan and the policies will start trickling through it as we get through the year. In terms of the budget, the next step for that will be February 6th. We will go back, and if there's any further questions or clarifications or modeling or calculations anyone wants done, please send it to us as soon as you can so we can get that prepared and ready for presentation on the 6th. We will be answering all the questions that were asked at the previous submission, the previous presentations, and tonight at that time, and giving an update on the public engagement results. At that point, it's also expected that we will start going through the decision packages and having some discussions about any steps that council wants to take in terms of the budget. From there, we will either schedule another committee of the whole meeting to go through any other outstanding items or look towards council approval. Those are the next steps.
Any questions for Heather? Councilor Chambers?
One of the things I'd like to see in the discussion going forward as the next step is the scenario of 2026 and 2027 using our long-term financial plan that we've just adopted with regard to transfers from operating to capital. I understand we don't raise debt to finance operating, but we do raise debt to finance capital projects. And I'm looking at that line, transfers from operating into the capital. In 2026 and 2027, it's a significant bump. It stands out like a camel's hump on the chart. And if that's what's going to be happening, then we need to be looking at how to mitigate that. So I'd like to see in our present budget, we have 16 million transferring to operating, from operating to capital. I'd like to see what we've done in the past, the previous 5 or 6 years, what we've done, because I can't remember. And maybe staff and the Treasury can look at ways to help mitigate 2026 and 2027 with 2025 budgets, if that makes sense. Because the increase in 2026 is significant. If we want to transfer almost 50% more from capital, from operating into capital, that's huge. That's a deviation from what we've done in the past. And looking at the other figures, it looks like roughly we should be, if we're going to use the financial plan, $20 million is about what an average going forward was what we should be putting from operating to capital. So we need to kind of look at that in terms of this budget to help next year's budget and maybe debt financings. And there may be some big grants come along that we can mitigate this year's transfer from capital, transfer to capital to offset what we should be doing. So I think you get the gist of what I'm saying.
Absolutely. We will have some of that. We might look at it on like maybe a 2025, 26, 27, 28, like maybe a 4-year basis and look at where we think we should be starting now to make those kind of more even on a shorter term, not the whole 10 years, because I agree that we don't know what's going on way beyond there, but I think in 3 or 4 year we can.
And to understand that the previous 3 years might be better if we had that information available to see what we've been trending.
Yep.
And again, with grants that may be coming, it may be the year to boost that with grant and debt. Who knows what will happen.
Thank you. Councillor Bell.
Yeah, I think it's along the same lines. The 25 to 26 is a massive rise in the debt charge. Can you share with us on February the 6th options for us to flatten that out as well?
We can look at it, but I suspect the 25-26 debt charges will be things that we've committed to already. So I think because we have a big debenture we're going to be doing this year for past projects, and so I think we're going to be starting to pay for that next year. And I don't know that we will look, but I don't know that that's something we can
So then,
address.
just be more specific. We do have the library to come up, which might be a pretty substantial debenture.
Yeah, it won't be 25 or 26 though.
No, but it might be 27, which is even bigger than 26.
Yeah, we're looking at 28 for that one, but absolutely, but yeah, it's in there. But yeah, in terms of 25-26, it's going to be tough for us to. I think it's going to be tough for us to make any headway on our debt charges.
Well, I'll leave you to model it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I don't think so. There's no communications. Does anyone have any other business? I didn't ask before, but is there anything that this council needs to hear about? No. We have no reason to go in camera. I'm looking for a mover to go back into open session. Councillor Kyle and Councillor Oakley. All those in favor? We reconvene as a council. We are now back as a council. And the only thing left is the adjournment, and the next meeting will be call of the chair. I don't have dates on my notes here. The answers to all the questions from the delegations will be in our Friday files from all three of the presenters tonight. And you'll get a hefty agenda package on Friday. It's going to be a wild. You think this weekend's wild? Next week's going to be very, very wild. We have a lot of very important decisions to make. So, with that being said, I'm looking for someone to